Hi everyone, welcome to today's Artist Talk Company, the Glucksman's current exhibition, Data Streams. I'm Chris Clark, Senior Curator here at the Glucksman. I'm pleased to welcome today Clemens von Wedemeyer. Clemens von Wedemeyer was born in 1974 in Göttingen, Germany, and currently lives and works in Berlin, where he holds a professorship for media art at the Academy of Fine Arts in Leipzig. He studied photography and media at the Fachhochschule in Bielefeld and the Academy of Fine Arts Leipzig, and graduated as Meisterschüler of Astrid Klein in 2005. Clemens has participated in group shows such as the first Moscow Biennial, the fourth Berlin Biennial, Sculpture Project Munster in 2007, the 16th Biennial of Sydney, and Documented 13, and has had solo shows among others at Museum of Modern Art PS1 New York, Argo Center for Art and Media in Brussels, the Barbican Art Center in London, Frankfurter Kunstverein, Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, and Hamburger Kunsthalle. STL 2015 premiered at the 66th Internationale Filmfestspiele in Berlin, Berlinale, in 2016, and is currently exhibiting as part of Data Streams Art Algorithms and Artificial Intelligence at the Glucksman. He's represented by KOW Gallery in Berlin, and I just want to say a big thanks to them for all their generosity in arranging the exhibition of his work here. We'll be discussing a number of Clemens' works today, including his current installation as part of Data Stream's Transformation Scenario. If you have any questions, please use the chat or Q&A function. We'll try to answer as many as we can. This talk will also be uploaded to the Glucksman's YouTube channel afterwards, so you can watch it back later on. But first, I want to say a big welcome to Clemens von Wedemeyer.
Hi, and thank you also for inviting me to the show and also to this talk. Thank you very much.
So I want to start by talking about the film Transformation Scenario 2018, commissioned for the Riga Biennial and currently exhibited here. And this is a film which features overlaying footage of crowd scenes, Hollywood movies, AI simulations, and eerily modern office spaces. Throughout, two narrators discuss the ways in which crowds are choreographed and orchestrated, and this includes clips from films such as Taxi Driver, iRobot, and The Warriors, as well as YouTube clips of the G20 protests, of police kettling techniques against Occupy Wall Street, the mosh pit at a Bad Brains concert, and how these movements can be monitored, tracked, simulated, and anticipated. As Alexander Koch describes it, the voices tout a new understanding of the human being, someone who, when caught up in a complex situation, no longer needs to decide for himself or herself what to do. And this mapping of individual and collective movements not only records but informs the ways in which we move. We might think here of GPS, Google Maps, online advertising, and tracking. And in this film, it presents the idea of an emulated society, where distinctions of individual agency and engineered automation become indistinguishable. Can you expand on this concept of the emulated society and what interested you in this idea?
Well, maybe I need to go back a little bit on the motivation also to make this video, because it started after 2015-16 with a kind of, in Germany especially, rise of like populist parties and a notion of the crowd somehow coming back in society. And that reminded me, and also this idea of like who has a larger amount of followers, for example, in a Facebook, or like the number suddenly played a bigger part in society, not only on the street with demonstrations, but especially in the digital realm. And I had a long-term interest in Elias Canetti's work, which is wrote in 1960, this book, Crowds and Power, which is a reflection, I think, on fascism and on the 20th century. And he tries to bring in some kind of rules of how crowds emerge, act, and dissolute. And it's kind of systemic, he speaks of a kind of a system of a crowd, something. So it's a bit problematic also, this book, because it's not very scientific, and it understands the crowd as a kind of anthropological constant, and not focuses much more if individuals. It focuses much more of the individual in power than the individual in the crowd. But what I found interesting in this idea of a system was then that I think the digital realm is quite close to these models that Elias Canetti describes. And I was then first, before doing the video or starting the video, I was doing a lot of research and interviews. And I interviewed sociologists, biologists, and so on. And so at one point, or quite late, came also this idea when thinking about the digital realm and simulating crowds. One could think of a kind of, or that was my idea at the time, that there was that there could be like a kind of world simulator. So if you can, but we have to maybe get to this later, because it's something that is talked almost at the end of transformation scenario. But this idea of if you can track many things in real life and feed simulations with it, maybe you get to a double picture of society, or what's happening, for example, in public space, which almost looks like, or with which you could almost do simulations of a possible better world or a different or an alternative world. And so if you would then if you would then use these simulations and predictions in order to influence society, then I thought one could speak of a kind of emulation.
And also it has a revolutionary potential. I mean, the film ends with the line, "Masses are in constant transformation," which is kind of like an ambiguous kind of way to end things, because on one level, we're talking about control and we're talking about kind of procedures to map and track and orchestrate movements. But at the same time, and this is something I've noticed in a few of your films, you know, there's often this kind of sense of a bursting against the seams. It's kind of emancipatory, liberatory kind of potential that's always built into the crowd. I'm thinking here even of the idea of the multitude as something that's you know, potentially kind of triggering kind of a change in societal kind of conditions.
The ending, it's interesting to start with the end, because I'm right now thinking of a second part of transformation scenario. But so the end with this notion of the transformation is like it's really central to the idea of the crowd, how Elias Canetti describes it, so that there never is a static mass, so to say. Like it's the idea of transformation is inherent in the human condition somehow, and especially in these crowd movements. And yeah, they are never static, and they never change. And it also touches a little bit this idea, because if we think of or if we believe that a lot of things can be simulated through digital means, let's say, and through data collection and so on, through tracking, through surveillance, then one can also become paranoid, you know, because you don't understand what's really happening. The data is kind of invisible. Maybe there's somebody behind, but then at the end you find out that it's us that feeds the data somehow. And so getting away from this notion of paranoia, I thought it's good to know that there's never like a static moment, or that everything is in flux and in transformation. So it's us that takes part in this simulation at the same time as we are feeding our data into whatever we are doing.
Well, maybe we can go back to the beginning then of the work as well, because right at the outset you present footage from the seminal documentary Woodstock, a film which it can be argued has proven more influential in our popular understanding of 1960s music counterculture than the actual music festival itself. And the ideals of this era were often recycled into Silicon Valley techno-utopianism of the early internet, aspiration which now seems hopelessly naive or maybe willfully misguided. Particularly as these technologies have been adapted to kind of corporate and military aims. Can you talk about why you chose to lead with this footage? And I also noticed when I was looking at the credits that the transformation scenario also includes clips from the Rolling Stones playing Sympathy for the Devil in 1969 at I think the Altamont concert, an event which is often marked as the end of 1960s idealism.
Exactly, yeah. So, as I told before, I took Elias Canetti's book Crowds and Power a little bit as a blueprint from the beginning, but also to start where he ends somehow, because his book is published in 1960. He's talking about the first half of the 20th century mostly, and I didn't want to make a film in black and white, so I clearly wanted to do something about today, and so I thought where to begin. And then I thought, what is like after the war, after the World War II, what is a good image to start with? And I was thinking about crowds that have a positive connotation somehow. And that's for me, for the first time, Woodstock in this cultural memory. And I used it, and then I thought of also of this idea of collective intelligence, that a crowd like Elias Canetti, but more specifically other people who worked on crowd psychology said in the early 20th century or late 19th century that the crowd is always as stupid as the most stupid person in the crowd somehow. So, and I think this notion changed with Woodstock a little bit, with this idea that everyone can participate. Together we are more clever, and there is a kind of intelligence in the crowd, and that was, I think, something new. And I know that Steve Jobs went to India. No, I mean there were clearly a lot of hippies in the founding of Silicon Valley also, and this notion of the early internet is also very much connected to this idea of connecting and connecting for the better, no? And this we know has been super commercialized, and this utopia has kind of turned sometimes into the opposite, or a nightmare. So I thought it would be good to start with Woodstock.
And I want to ask you a little bit about this modeling of individual behaviors through AI simulations. There's a part in the film where the narrators talk about the necessity to pass through the uncanny valley to achieve this verisimilitude that doesn't unsettle human viewers. And the exchange can't help but raise questions around the so-called deepfake technologies and the ability to create seamless simulations of real-world figures and events. Is this something that you anticipate with this film? This seemed to kind of pop into the mainstream sometime around 2008 or so, where it became kind of more widely known. And particularly because your practice has long explored the blurring of reportage and cinema reality and artifice. So is this an area of interest in your current practice?
Yeah, I think this idea of uncanniness. It's true that what you say, that it's a special interest of mine to think about the creation of fiction and this shift when something is kind of turning around and suddenly you're falling into the trap somehow of the fiction. You're being yeah dissimulated. I don't know, the English word doesn't come to my mind, but I think this uncanny valley is so interesting because it's also clear, like if you want to simulate an individual, um, it's much more complicated than to simulate a crowd, actually. Because if you look from afar, a simulated crowd in CGI looks pretty fast. It looks like really, it could look like a crowd that is moving through a cityscape, for example. And then we suddenly think, okay, that it looks really good. But if you want to produce a robot or produce an individual human being, one could even say like it will never happen, because the uncanny valley, which is this this perception of anthropomorphic robots and the acceptance of robots, like, declines dramatically when they're giving when you really try to come close to simulate a human. So that was one point in it, for sure.
And there's also a part in the film as well where you talk about this idea of simulated revolution, and that's the topic that feels kind of particularly contemporary in the prevalence of false flag operations, disinformation campaigns, and asymmetrical warfare. We seem to be seeing these concepts playing out in real time at the moment. And I wonder what your thoughts are about these developments and whether it's been a factor in your practice, its themes and your approaches.
I mean, when I spoke in one interview with Dirk Helbing, for example, like he would say one could never simulate or predict a revolution. If we have, it's very easy to simulate pedestrians in a city walking around, or and so on. But like it's it's a bit like this butterfly effect or something like this. But what interested me in revolution, in the notion of revolution, is on one hand that it often is also connected to large amounts of crowds and the public space, and like real visibility and action in real life, and that there's no, I mean, revolutions are more and more also fostered by social media and so on. If we think of the Arab Spring, for example, etc. But still, we connect the revolution with real actions on the street somehow. But then we also talk about the digital revolution as a revolution and so on, but it's much more a transformation. That is one aspect, and I think I think that it's of course it always triggers something, because if we see, like I'm in the video, I'm trying to trigger emotions of or revolutionary moments just by these with symbols, this burning a Molotov cocktail, for example, that is then stands in place for this kind of idea of revolution. And I was playing actually with these images that trigger emotions. So it's true that it's that cinema is really very good and very professional in triggering emotions through images. And this was something that I wanted to show off with somehow, but also at the same time show that it's just an image. Maybe it's also interesting to say that I was looking a lot also at other at the film industry, especially because these movements, simulation of crowd movements, were especially developed by companies. For example, the company that did the simulations for Lord of the Rings, and they produced a new system, new algorithms, in which the individual so-called digital agents have a limited freedom to act, and they can also, they kind of look through their own eyes and making decisions. And so the CGI and post-production machine of Hollywood cinema not only produces these images of emotion, but also algorithms and systems which are at the same time developed by scientists, sociologists, physicists in physics, and so on.
I mean, it's fascinating that actually something that even when we know what we're watching is just it's a simulated environment. It's like a computer generated scenario. But you're able to kind of employ certain kind of cinematic structures to kind of create a sense of narrative and actually a real strong kind of emotional impulse. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about another film of yours from around the same period, 70,001, which uses a computer simulated reconstruction of protests in Leipzig in 1989. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about this particular work, which again has this kind of very strong cinematic quality, and maybe the significance of this kind of date and site for you, as well as how you actually kind of built up this reconstruction of events.
It's kind of a site-specific work because I was invited to an exhibition at the Gallery of Contemporary Art in Leipzig, GFZK, and at the same time it was the 30th anniversary of the so-called peaceful revolution in Eastern Germany, and in Leipzig this all started somehow with big demonstrations in September and October 1989. And one demonstration was particularly important because it was filmed, and the video was transferred to the West in the same night, and then aired the next day in West German television. And so the image of the crowd somehow also became apparent to everyone in the East that watched Western television. And it was said that the amount of people taking part in this demonstration, which was going around the ring, around the old city of Leipzig, was 70,000. Probably it was much more, but the organizers didn't want to over-exaggerate. So what I did is we produced a simulation by using a model of the city of Leipzig and then placing these digital agents that would then walk and demonstrate within the simulated world. And what I initially wanted to do was really get algorithms that could, recreate or reenact what was happening. But of course, it's not so easy. So the algorithms were, we changed some things. For example, we said that people would never go home. They would always stay. That's a law also that kind of Elias Canetti wrote, that the crowd always wants to grow. So we kind of over-exaggerated and made it a bit uncanny. So from the beginning, where it looks more like a reenactment in today's Leipzig, then it gets more and more uncanny and more weird, and different than the actual historical demonstrations.
Yeah, it has that feel of something that starts as kind of the historical record, and there's this kind of moment where you see this kind of the crowd numbers swelling and pulsing. There's this kind of electronic score as well, which kind of builds and builds towards something, and then we kind of see this this moment of kind of this loss of kind of control as well, where technology overtakes people power as a means of protest. And I guess you kind of alluded to this with the Arab Spring as well, the way that things like Twitter and stuff like that were used then for kind of organizational kind of principles, and the way they kind of became networked in a different way and kind of subverted the actual kind of corporate intentions of these things, or maybe realized them in a different kind of way.
Yeah, I mean, what is interesting is like this feeding data into one data space, which, for example, it could be Google, with Google Maps, for example. It's interesting that they, for example, yesterday switched off the system in Ukraine that you could see if there's a traffic jam in front of you, because it could reveal a certain military action of the Ukrainian army, etc., etc. So when we did this video with this in Leipzig, only produced in virtual space, I suddenly thought of the Google Maps could easily turn also three-dimensional, and you could, because they already have all the data, or most of the data, and you could watch and see the tram running and see how many people would sit in there and so on. So, I mean, there's already so much data that can be used to produce a three-dimensional view of the world, which then really would look more like a simulation, much more cinematic than it looks now in Google Maps.
I also want to ask you about another work, Crowd Control, which has a strong correlation with 70,001 and of course with Transformation Scenario. And in this film we see what appears to be, anyways, unmediated raw screen footage of the simulated software used for police countermeasure techniques. How did this work come about? I mean, is this off-the-shelf software? And does the work present a sort of demystification of the training methods being utilized by police and military forces?
Yeah, this is a bit like a making of, I think. But it really, it's an existing software, which is not, I think, not used anymore, but it was developed for the police of the Netherlands, in Rotterdam, I think. And we went there and sat with the people in the office and asked them to produce 3 different typical situations. One where there are only a few protesters, one where there are like protesters and police would be half-half, and a third one with a kind of revolutionary moment where the police is in minority. And so, yes, what they use this for is actually for strategic rehearsals and tactics and communication between people planning countermeasures of the police and people who are there in the crowd and report to the police what to do. So they are using this technique to simulate that.
But it's funny when you talk about kind of, and I'm going to come back to the behind the scenes part here as well, but when you talk about the cinematic nature of it, to have that kind of third sequence where you see these computer generated protesters who are even like waving signs, let's say like things like, boo or freedom, and they kind of break through police lines and they start wearing masks and they have flares, and it actually, like, the narrative actually kind of changes as you watch it. For something that initially has that kind of feel of, a computer demonstration or like a Twitch stream or something like that, you become kind of caught up in this kind of this blatantly simulated artificial scenario, but you get caught up in the kind of narrative thrust of it, the emotive kind of qualities of the film.
Yeah, also I think it's terrible because it's so biased, and how they imagine a society that demonstrates, and it's weird because the demonstrators are super diverse, and kind of have this a little bit of a leftist touch, I think, and the policemen are all
completely identical,
same, you know?
yeah. And actually look like some kind of Hollywood caricature of like a thuggish policeman.
Yeah, yeah. So it's really terrible, actually, how and there you really see also how in programs bias of everyday life and so on gets reproduced and exaggerated, therefore. And
I'm glad you.
This is also a topic about AI, no? Because the bias of AI is a topic that came up in the last years.
Yeah, well, actually, I mean, it's interesting you say that because, obviously some of the research that's gone into the data streams exhibition was around the idea of kind of, technology being kind of put out there as inherently neutral or objective. But of course, actually, it has racial bias, it has systemic, racism and biases programmed into it. But it kind of uses this kind of idea of like, well, this is algorithmic technology as a way of kind of suggesting that, oh no, this cannot have any kind of, subjective personal biases. It's programmed out of it. And of course, what it obscures is the fact that there are always people actually inputting that data. There's a whole society that gets fed into it that just replicates institutional racism.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, like also in AI, it really depends on the data you feed the learning machine with. So yeah.
You mentioned it before, just before I take a couple of questions from the audience here, and certainly if anyone has a question for Clemens, use the Q&A, use the chat function. But you mentioned the kind of behind the scenes thing, and this is something that's long fascinated me about your practice. And I know we're going to go way back here to some early works here, but there's something about crowd control that does have that kind of sense of, it's like an extra feature you might find on a DVD or something to show the kind of the underlying kind of making of it. And this has been an element in your practice for some time. I'm thinking of the making of Occupation back in 2002, and even films like Muster or Rushes, Rushes being that term that denotes the daily prints of a day's filming that gets watched back. And the way that these works reveal the staging and production devices required to achieve a level of cinematic narrative or veracity. Can you talk a little bit about this aspect of your practice? I know this is a big question, but
yeah, I mean, I'm really interested in deceiving, I think, or in also in using cinematic effects, because I like how cinema functions, and one always wanted to understand also how I get emotionally catched by certain things in cinema and so on. And then instead of doing films for cinema myself, I became much more like critical and tried to reveal. So I'm really always shifting between this deceiving moment and this revealing moment. And that's why, and with Occupation, maybe just to tell to everyone. So Occupation is a film which is about a film scene. And in this film scene, there's a crowd of extras, and they are being pushed around by the film crew. And then at the end, they run away and overrun the crew. And because it's happening in the night, everything gets dark because the lights fall down, etc. And while doing this, we were shooting the fiction, but at the same time shooting us doing the film. So there were actually two film teams, one fictional film crew and one real film crew, but the crowd was the same. And since then I was, or also with videos after, I was always interested in trying to act not ideological, or trying to find different viewpoints of on a certain topic, and to look at a certain, or on something that interests me from really different perspectives.
I also had a question from the audience here, which kind of touches on this idea of kind of film. Do you draw influence from filmmakers, art house as well as Hollywood, and if so, whom?
I mean, yeah, it really changes so much. It always changed. From in the beginning, I think it was much more yeah, people from directors from film history, for example, Occupation. It was very much inspired by Eisenstein, but at the same time, I was a fan of David Lynch also. But then Antonioni and then Chantal Ackermann, for example. I mean, but really there are so many around now that I can't say it anymore, because I also because I'm also so much interested in so many different styles and genres between art and film, that is yeah, it's not only filmmakers.
And a second part to that question, which is, and what are your thoughts on propaganda, and does this inform your work? I mean, there are obviously, you mentioned Eisenstein, I guess, who has that, that kind of background, although we tend to think, beyond him as just a propagandist these days. But
yeah, I mean, propaganda. Yeah, for sure, but it's probably this interest, I think, in propaganda, which doesn't necessarily look like propaganda on the first view. But of course, propaganda is just one part of image of, or it's a genre also somehow, so yeah, of course, it's very important. But for me, often a bit boring, because it's if it really looks like a propaganda, then it's a bit too simple for me. But yeah.
and I have another question here as well. Everybody comes in towards the end. I was wondering if we could learn a little more about the practical planning process of the films. So again, this is kind of a big one, and I guess the things certainly in some of the actual works you make seem to they reveal the kind of planning or the kind of preparation. But maybe if you can just briefly kind of take us through, like, what are some of the kind of in terms of kind of start to finish, and even for work like transformation scenario, you mentioned talking to sociologists and scientists and these things, but what are that kind of starting points, I guess, that that as a artist with an idea, what do you what are the steps?
Yeah, difficult. With transformation scenario, it was a good project for me, because I didn't have usually I have an exhibition or a site, or like a site specific project, and with transformation scenario, yes, I had the Riga Biennial coming up, but I was pretty free in anything else, and so everything, I only collected notes in the beginning. I fed like a notepad with notes and so on, and at the same time I was researching and downloading YouTube videos and stock footage from the internet, and collected it in different bins and folders connected to different topics and themes that would then develop. And at one point I I made many tries, and then I started to having a kind of aesthetic, I thought, and so I started to write the text, and then the text was the major topic, and I then needed help with the text, so I asked a co-author to help me, and then I would I think read it myself, record it, and then start to do the editing, changing the text, changing the images, and then only at the end, when I was happy, that then I would record the whole thing with the voice actors.
So, I mean, obviously post-production is a big part of it, but you don't go through kind of processes of storyboarding or...
I mean, this is for, I mean, Transformation Scenario is a complete found footage film. And other films are different. So yes, a storyboard is usually important if you're shooting on site, and then I would try to make a storyboard before with a camera person, a DOP, and then latest would be like the day before the shooting, you know, to do a storyboard, but often it's already before. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Clemens. And thanks everybody for the questions today. I really appreciate this. I know you're very busy, and of course, your thoughts and everyone else's are elsewhere at the moment, thinking of what's happening in Ukraine. So it's very much appreciated. And thank you very much. Data Streams is on until 13th of March here at the Glucksman in Cork. But once again, thank you very much to Clemens von Wedemeyer.
Thank you too. And have a good finish of the exhibition.